especially important if you intend to ask a question. Questions will be taken after the presentation. So that we can make best use of the Q&A session, please type a brief summary of your question in the chat box on your screen. Only questions that have been added to the queue will be put to the speaker. That allows me to identify duplicates and so on. You will be invited to put your question to the speaker verbally. For the benefit of other participants, if you have a microphone headset, please use that. We strongly encourage participants to put their questions verbally, but if you really prefer not to, please say so in the chat and I will read the question on your behalf. When putting a question, please give your name and tell us which country you're calling from. And finally, a reminder that today's webinar is recorded for your future reference and also for the people in extreme time zones who are unable to join us today. So very briefly about Eye on Earth. Eye on Earth is a global movement that was launched in 2011. Guided by a suite of 14 principles, Eye on Earth is committed to advancing sustainable development by enabling better informed decision making. It does this by facilitating networking and capacity development within and between the diversity of knowledge stakeholders. Eye on Earth comprises two main components. First, a convening and governing alliance of some of the foremost organizations in the information for sustainable development sector. And they are, in alphabetical order, the Group of Earth Observations headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, also headquartered just down the road from Geneva, Switzerland, the UN Environment Programme, UN Environment, headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, and the World Resources Institute, WRI, which is headquartered in Washington, DC, and also my own employer, the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. The second component of Eye on Earth is yourselves, a global community of practitioners who share and support the Eye on Earth mission, vision, and principles. More details about Eye on Earth can be found at our website. The URL is shown there in red, and please do note the hyphens between Eye on Earth. Fundamentally, Eye on Earth is about convergence, collaboration, and knowledge sharing. The magnitude and diversity of knowledge within the Eye on Earth movement is exemplified by the number and diversity of people who have registered for this webinar. Please take a look at the fantastic diversity of countries of our 200 plus registrants for today's webinar. Of course, not all these people are able to join us live because of the diversity of time zones, but everyone who registered will receive in about a week's time a link to the recording of this meeting. If you find the webinar useful, please share the invitation that you received with your colleagues. It is possible to register after the event and access the recording. By collaborating and exchanging knowledge across disciplines and geographies, we can leverage synergies and make a significant contribution to sustainable development. So about our speaker, I'm truly delighted to introduce today's expert, Dr. David Stanners. David has been a strong supporter of Eye on Earth movement right from the beginning. Long-term members of the community will remember David served as chair of one of the former special initiatives, the Global Network of Networks. David is head of program for partnerships and networks at the European Environment Agency, which is headquartered in Copenhagen, Denmark, from where he joins us today. David has been a senior manager with the EEA for 22 years, according to my calculation. David holds a PhD in environmental sciences from Lancaster University in the UK. His current interests include improving the science policy people interface, including integrated assessments, transitions and sustainability systems science, scenarios and precaution, risk, uncertainty and complexity, and lay, local and traditional knowledge and citizen science. David has worked extensively at the science policy interface with the European Union to support environment and sustainability policy and decision making. David's current responsibilities include the management and coordination of IONET, a 39-country European environmental information and observation network, cooperation with the European neighbourhood countries to the south and east, and the development of cooperation between the EEA and international organisations, particularly the UN Economic Commission for Europe, the UN Environment Programme, and non-European bodies to promote the development and sharing of environmental knowledge to support sustainable development. So I think you will agree that it is difficult to imagine someone more closely aligned with the Iron Earth mission and vision than David. So without further delay, I will transfer the presenter mode to David and invite David to give his presentation. So David, just give me 1 second to do that, and then make you the presenter. So you should have an invitation, David, and then the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm looking at the presentation. I can't see the invitation yet. Yeah, got it.
And I see your screen.
Is it the correct screen, Derek?
Yes, it is, David.
It is the correct one. Very good. Well, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. It's my pleasure and privilege to be able to present to you today about the EEA and the IONET. You should see on the screen a beautiful picture of Copenhagen as it used to look, with lovely trees in the middle of Kongens Nytorv, no longer because of a large amount of work being done in the center of Copenhagen for a new public transport metro system, but in a few years' time it'll be all back to looking like this. It's a little cool, but spring weather here, and looking positive over the next few days. So I will be trying to explain to you in this webinar the development of the EEA and IONET, where's it come from historically, its aims and missions, how it's organized, the lessons that we've learned in the development of this network and agency, some of the methodologies that we follow, and then I will look forward to issues in the future and the future challenges that we've got. So let's start off with a little bit of a journey on a snaky line. The European Environment Agency was established by a law, a regulation that was passed in the EU in 1990. And this was not appearing out of nowhere. It appeared about 20 years after the Stockholm Conference and all of the developments developing the law, the European, what we call environmental acquis, the environmental law base between the 1970s and the 1990s, which raised the question about how do we manage all the knowledge and data that we need to manage the environment. So in 1990, it was agreed to set up the European Environment Agency and IONET. As years went on, of course, we know about the very many developments that occurred. Soon after then was the UNFCCC. In 1994, we actually arrived eventually in Copenhagen and set up offices and started actually working. We had this 4 years of preparation because politicians took a long while to decide where to headquarters the agency. Anyway, we were lucky and fortunate enough for them to decide it was going to be in Copenhagen. Around the same time, the very first assessment of Europe's environment was published, which I was privileged to be a co-editor on, the Dobruch assessment, which really set the baseline for future state of environment reporting on Europe's environment. This was followed after the different years. In 1990, we had 1998, we had another pan-European report. In 2000, we had another report on EU's environment. In 2005, the icon there, we produced a BRIC, which was the 2005 State Environment Report. And this is the last report that I think will ever appear, which is with a greater weight than all of the other reports we got before. It was about probably 20 or 30 centimeters thick and about 3 kilos in weight. From now on, things are getting a little bit lighter since then. In 2010, we produced a very slim volume of the State of Environment Report. And then during this whole period, there was a development of the data, particularly the satellite information that we were beginning to utilize in our assessments and policy support, which in 2012 meant that we had the first launches of the Copernicus satellite work and the first responsibilities that we took on under Copernicus to maintain and manage the in situ part of the work from Copernicus, which we're now benefiting from. The current phase that we're in between 2013 and 2020 is a phase of a whole new now approach and work program that we've got, which I'll talk about in further detail. In 2013, we adopted a new multi-annual work program, which now extends to 2020. And the European Commission adopted soon after its 7th Environmental Action Program, which I will be talking about a little bit later. And it's a fundamental program talking about basically how we need to transition our society into a sustainable society, and how we need to develop a low carbon, a circular economy. And I'll talk about that later. And so the multi-annual work program of the European Environment Agency is a support mechanism for the 7th Environmental Action Program of the European Union. In 2015, we produced our next 5-year State of Environment report, which talks very strongly about the need for transitions and the need for systems change. As we all know, the same year the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, which now provides a kind of a common language globally for talking about these things, a kind of an Esperanto, you could say, which helps translate different objectives between different regions and different countries globally. And also the same year with the Paris COP, the work that we're now doing is basically there to support all of these types of activities at global level too. The European Union's contributions to these various efforts on sustainable development goals, on the climate goals with the Paris commitments, the circular economy package, the energy union, and the Convention on Biodiversity activities. The Commission in 2016 published its communication on sustainable development goals, which is our roadmap to supporting this work in the future. So this basically sets out the context of the European Environment Agency. It's very much situated within these European and global activities and situated to support the policymaker. The European Environment Agency is not a policymaker itself. It is what you would call a boundary organization, helping to translate the science to the policy and the policy back to the science, and communicating broadly to the public to raise awareness. So we're a facilitator in this process, firmly established within the European and international setting of environment and sustainability activities. So let me just go back to some basics. Now I've given you that broader picture and explained about some of the details, because I think within these details you find the DNA of the success so far of this type of model. And a lot of interest has been shown in this model globally from different parts of the world. The latest country that's shown interest is China, looking at the way in which the European Union is working with its 30 plus countries, 28 and then a few others. I'll explain that in a moment. And China working with its different regions and provinces. How does it do that? So I will go through some of the establishing rules and objectives, because I think it helps understand why the success of the EEA and INET, at least to the current time that I can speak to. So there was a formal law to begin with, which was established and adopted by all of the different countries, which was eventually amended and improved in 2009 to establish the EEA and the network. And I'll explain about the distinction of those two things in a moment, but it's not just an agency that was established, it was a network across the member countries. And the main objectives of the EEA and INET was to provide objective, reliable, comparable information at European level. One of the apocryphal stories from the very beginning about the EEA was at the time of the Chernobyl accident, when Jacques Delors, who was president of the Commission at the time, asked for a map and information about the impact of radioactive deposition from cesium-137 primarily at that time across Europe. And when the map was produced, in fact, in another form, I was actually involved in producing that at the Joint Research Centre in Italy. what you could see was the border lines between the different countries. You could see a border between Italy and Switzerland and France and Germany and the Netherlands. And why should there be border lines when we're talking about natural deposition? Well, the reason, of course, is that the methodologies and approaches for measuring radioactivity and the way of reporting were different in every country. So what we got, instead of a European picture, we got a jigsaw puzzle of national views put together, which didn't make European sense at all. So Jacques Delors commented, this is back in 1987, actually, we need a European agency to create a European picture, not just a mishmash of jigsaw puzzle pieces from the national countries. And I think that example exemplifies the main objective of the agency, to provide this European picture of objective, reliable information. And of course, next to that is to ensure that the public is properly informed about the state of the environment. Also, the agency was to provide the necessary technical and scientific support to the development of European environmental policy, but also policy at national level as well. Now, I mentioned that the agency was established together with this so-called network, and the idea here was the European Environment Agency itself, as an institution, as an entity, had the responsibility given it through the regulation to coordinate the network. And the network was identified to be the series of existing functionalities, existing capacities, institutions across the member states of the European Union. Those existing capacities networked together. So the idea was not to duplicate, not to do the work of the countries, but to join together and coordinate those activities in a way which would add value and which would help support the European level policy, and also help peer-to-peer relationships between the countries and build the capacity and knowledge that is required to tackle environmental issues. And so this network, which eventually came to be termed IONET, the European Environment Information and Observation Network, is basically composed of national focal points, reference centres, and topic centres. And I'll mention in more detail those and which they are. Another important aspect of the European activities was that, as I showed on that timeline before, there have been an increasing number of international activities going on, where individual countries had to make contributions to. And the countries basically were asking at that time, you need to help us at the European level make a coordinated set of inputs. So the objective of the European Environment Agency was to support European level information being inserted into international environmental monitoring programs and activities in a streamlined and efficient manner than just adding up all the different parts from the different countries, and to support the countries doing that. And then another objective was actually to produce a report on the state and trends and prospects of the environment every 5 years. As I mentioned on the timeline, we've actually done that with the first report in 1995, the Pan-European report on the state of the environment called the Dobrich Assessment, and the last one published in 2015. The regulation goes on and talks about some other aspects which are really quite interesting. Basically, it talks about that the work of the European Environment Agency has to look at the state of the environment from the point of view of the quality, the pressures on, and the sensitivity on the environment, including placing this in the context of sustainable development. And these points and these individual words came to have a lot of importance in the early days of development, when we began to talk about emissions to air, or emissions from industrial or energy power plants, for example. And there was some pullback from the politicians and others saying, no, your role is on the state of the environment. Your role is not to talk about what is impacting on the environment. Just tell us what the state is. And we were able to refer back to the regulation, say, no, we need to describe the pressures on the environment as well, which talks about the driving forces. And this is extremely important, and we've had a number of pushbacks to try to get us to focus only on the state And I know this experience is common in many agencies. So to include the pressures and the driving forces is extremely important. And the other part which is extremely important is the context of sustainable development. So here we're saying we just don't look at the environment on its own. We have to look at the environment in the context of the economic cycle, of the economic world, in the context of the social and people living in it. So that we're not just talking about birds and the bees, we're talking about the full context and the environmental aspects within that context. Some specific areas were mentioned: air quality, water quality, soil, waste, natural resources, to demonstrate the breadth of subject matter that we had to deal with. Climate at that time was not mentioned. It can be inferred, of course. We now do work on climate, and in the coming years there will be probably a revision of a regulation following an evaluation of the EEA and INET, which is happening this year. It happens every 4 to 5 years, and there probably will be a change in the regulation to include climate as well. An additional aspect was that right from the get-go, it was understood that we needed to look at plurinational, transfrontier, and global phenomena in all of our work, so setting our work in this international context, as I underlined before, as well as the socioeconomic dimension, which is fundamental for looking at sustainable development issues. So those are some details of the regulation. I hope they weren't too boring to go into those details, but they form for us in law a very solid foundation which has stood the test of time over 20 years, which doesn't require very much change at all. So the writers of that regulation were very forward thinking. One of them, Stanley Johnson, who is the father of the current Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson in the UK, he was one of the authors of the regulation, and it's really stood the test of time. And from that, we developed a long-standing, robust, which is developed a robust mission from this. And this mission basically says that we need to provide reliable, relevant, targeted, and timely information to policy-making agents and the public, and then to help achieve significant and measurable improvement in Europe's environment and support sustainable development. So in just kind of 1 or 2 sentences, we were able to synthesize the regulation. And this is the mission statement that we still work to. So much then for the basics. Let me just talk very briefly about the governance. Where do we stand? How are we organized? Well, once it's set up by an EU regulation, the fundamental control mechanism of the European Environment Agency comes from its management board. And on the management board is basically the senior civil servant of all the member countries on environment. So the top civil servant on environment in all of the member countries. I'll come to the membership in a second. 2 representatives of the European Commission, and that's from DG Environment and DG Klima, together with somebody from, as alternates, from Eurostat and the John Research Center. And then 2 notable personalities on the environment, which are nominated by the European Parliament. So we have quite a large board, but a very broad board, including all of the various stakeholders and actors. We do not include non-governmental organizations or business organizations like a couple of European agencies do, but we have nevertheless a pretty broad management board structure. So the EEA is organized by the management board and governed by the board. The EEA itself then organizes and coordinates the INET. And then in addition, we have a scientific committee, which is there for advising the executive director on all matters scientific, including the identification and of scientific staff to the agency, and supporting the development of its work program and scientific activities. So let's come to the membership of the European Environment Agency. The membership goes actually beyond the membership of the European Union, though it's fundamentally a European Union agency. Back in '93, this meant actually that there were only 12 members. We tend to forget that. In '93, European Union was just 12 members. In 95, though, the membership increased to 18 countries, with 3 new members of the European Union: Austria, Finland, and Sweden. They only joined in 95, believe it or not, but also 3 new EFTA countries, so Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, which also joined formally the European Environment Agency. In 2002, the European Environment Agency was significantly enlarged, to watch this, to the east. And basically, there was a large negotiation with the eastern countries before they joined the European Union, indeed. And so the European Environment Agency was open to the candidate countries in the Eastern Europe, and expanded then the membership in 2002 to 29 countries. The following year, Poland and Turkey joined. Poland should have joined the previous year, but was delayed by its government by 1 year. And then Turkey also joined. And we're the only European Union organization that has Turkey as a full member. In 2006, Croatia joined, as it joined the European Union. And then the current status is that we also work very closely with the West Balkan countries. So the full membership of the agency is 33 member countries and 39 countries, including the West Balkans, which we work with also systematically. So as you can see, this is a policy and an approach which helps support not just European Union policy, but also supports the joining together of other countries into the European Union setting. So given this membership, let's stand back and talk about the model of activities. How do we carry out our activities, and what do we do? And these 3 elements: institutional cooperation, the content that we work on, common content, and the shared infrastructure. These are 3 things which we always identify and work with and try to exemplify in all of our work programs. And we make an emphasis of these 3 because if you don't, often you end up focusing only on maybe the technology and infrastructure in a network, or you sometimes end up just talking about the content. But the institutional cooperation together with those other 2 elements is fundamental to the work. Without the institutional setting and cooperation, we could not do these activities together. So we emphasize a balance of these 3 elements in all of our activities, whatever they might be, whether it be collecting environmental data, whether it be assessment, developing an indicator or an assessment report. These 3 elements always have to be part of the work. Another part of our methodology and approach is the way in which we interact with the countries. And this model, which resembles exchange of electrons between atoms, I think you can see, it demonstrates the way in which, on the left-hand side, the European Environment Agency is benefiting from the expertise in the national setting. So the blue on the right, you can imagine there's 39 of those representing 39 countries. And we're exchanging with those countries, both we're sharing with them and they're sharing with us experts and knowledge. And the national reference centers, NRCs, are their nominated experts in 24 areas of expertise, which work directly with us in mini networks. For example, on climate change, on soil, on air quality, air emissions, industrial pollution, etc. And our topic centers, ETCs, are those which are specialized consortium focused on areas of interest, and I'll get to those. So this is the model of cooperation whereby we don't sit in our separate silos, but we exchange expertise, people, we exchange experts between ourselves as well as the knowledge itself. These 6 European topic centers, these are the 6. These are the specialized consortia which work long-term with us under contract over a period of 3 to 5 years on air pollution, biological diversity, as you can see, climate, urban waste, and inland coastal waters. And these are the ones who are doing a lot of the analytical work, quality assurance work, and doing the basics of our reporting on assessment as well, together with the staff of the agency of about 200, 220 people at the headquarters at Copenhagen. And so across the IONET across these topic centers, national reference centers, etc. We have probably around 1,800, 2,000 experts from our over 400 national institutions that we are regularly interacting with the 39 national focal points, the 6 topic centers, 24 NRCs, as I mentioned. And we have every year, in 2015 at least, we had around 15, I think we had about 16, 17 last year, NRC meetings of these national reference centers. So that's the kind of the work that we do, and all of that effort results in a number of activities, hopefully, some content. We produced in 2015 around 40 reports, 41 indicators, around 100 plus maps, and we have media coverage and website traffic that's on there, as you can see on this. So the content of what we produce, it can be found very clearly in the reports, indicators, and maps, which are feeding into the policy cycle at the appropriate stages to support the development of new policy and the evaluation of policy as it goes on, and support the implementation at the member state level. The viewing of our map services is a kind of a proxy for the way in which our information services and knowledge services are getting increasing access to the public. This has increased tremendously just over the last 10 years, from under 1 million hits or so of maps back in around 27, up to more than 7 million hits of map views. In fact, it's 70 million hits of map views in the current stage. So this is increasing tremendously, and this is a proxy for the type of interest that we are noticing, at least, in the information and knowledge that we have, and probably in your organizations you have a similar type of increase as well. So if we now move on about the way in which we create and make the knowledge and information, how we use it, we have 3 types of activity in our work. The types of activity that we've got fundamentally are to do with informing policy implementation. This is the support at the policy interface. But to do that, we need to create the knowledge. We need to collect the data from the countries. We need to assess that, but we also need to create new knowledge. And we talk about knowledge co-creation, sharing, and use. And in order to inform policy implementation, we say we actually need to assess systemic challenges. And I'll get to that in more detail in a moment, which in itself then will inform policy implementation. So this is the virtuous cycle that we're trying to develop in all of our activities. Now, fundamental to this is based upon our concept of the so-called shared environment information system, which has this content cooperation infrastructure elements, which I mentioned before. And this concept of the shared environmental information system had its birth probably in around 1999-2000, when the countries in the early days, as I have mentioned before, were struggling with the number of different contributions they had to make individually to European directives and international conventions of contributions of reporting and data and information. And they said, this is a chaos. You need to put this all together in a shared environmental information system, so that as a country, I can just share it once, and it can be available for multiple purposes, for multiple conventions, multiple directives, reports, and assessments. And so out of that, we developed together with the countries this concept, which is based upon a set of principles, which you can find on this slide. And basically we said, as the second principle says, information needs to be collected once and shared with others for many, many purposes. And then the information itself does not go into a central database. It's managed as close as possible to its source. And of course, over the last 20 years, the revolution of ICT has allowed this, compared with 1999, when such a management information was not as easy. The third principle is that the information must all be readily available to easily fulfill reporting obligations, which is not always the case. It was in textual form or is in a format which was not easily able to be used. It should be easily accessible to all users. We should not just privilege one group of maybe policymakers, but all users mean the public, maybe means business, maybe means NGOs. There are many different actors at different levels, local authorities, cities as well. And that's very challenging to make it available, but that's a principle. And it also should be accessible to enable there to be comparisons at the appropriate scale, particularly geographical. And often information is made available, so it's a summary at maybe national level, which is useless to make any proper analysis. So the information needs to be appropriately disaggregated to be useful for analytical purposes and fully available to the general public with appropriate national language specification, because this can be a huge barrier for access for the general public if the information is only available in English. And then lastly, to support it through common, free, open software standards to make sure that the information can be used as openly as possible. So this fundamental concept of shared environmental information system is very important to understand, because it's not a system like an individual system that you plug and play. It's a set of principles that we apply all our work to whenever we develop new knowledge information in our processes, and whenever the member countries also produce their information, they try to follow as closely as possible these principles, and we make evaluations of this every year, how closely we are coming to fulfilling these principles, because of course it's impossible to reach them fully, but we aspire to implement them fully. So a few words now then in terms of our work and how we do things, how we structure that in our work programs. Our work program, which now goes from 2014, 2013 to 2020, has these different areas. It basically has, as I mentioned before, informing policy implementation, assessing systemic challenges, and knowledge co-creation, which is this virtuous cycle I was talking about, of course, with the EEA management as well. And I won't go into detail when it comes to informing policy implementation. It, of course, covers all of these different areas. We have groups in the agency with at least one or two experts in each of these areas. And we have in each of these areas a number of national reference centers in the countries. So we have top expertise in the countries working in these different areas on air, on pollution, in climate change, water, waste, etc. We then have another second part of our work program, which is more, you could argue, the integrated assessment part, although integrated assessment does appear also in the individual thematic work, but the major bringing together of the information happens in our part of the work program assessing systemic challenges, where we do the main state of environment reports, where we look at the environment, human health and well-being, where we look at the resource efficient economy, the so-called circular economy, and we also look at transitions and megatrends as well. And then in the third part of the work program, we talk about the work that's needed to join together the various partners, the knowledge co-creation, sharing and use, and the abilities to come together, and the different capacity building exercises that we need to enable the other two parts of the work program. So part 3 is an enabler of the other two parts. There's networking, the technical systems, of course, special capacity building in the West Balkans and in the neighborhood, I'll mention this in a second, communication, outreach, monitoring, quality management, and the Copernicus operational services, which I mentioned right from the beginning about land cover, to do with remote sensing, but also including the land cover work that has been there from the very beginning of the agency's activities. Within this work program, this capacity building work actually goes beyond the membership. And this is what I wanted to explain, how we're embedded in the neighborhood. The blue countries, light and dark, are the member 39 and cooperating countries in the West Balkans. But we also work extremely closely with additional funds from the Commission with the 6 partnership countries to the east. That is, of course, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the Caucasus, and the European neighborhood countries in the south as well, extending all the way from Tunisia, Morocco, and across to the Middle East as well. So these are the European Union neighborhood countries, and we receive additional earmarked resources to work directly with those countries, around 10 to 11 million over a 5-year period. And the agency's budget, I should tell you, is around 50 million per year approximately. So that's the near area where we work with the neighborhood, but we also work in this capacity building, co-creation, knowledge co-creation, also internationally. We work with the UN on the UN activities, United Nations Environmental Assembly and its United Nations Environment Programme, or UN Environment as they're now calling themselves. We do have bilateral work together with the US, with Central Asia and with Korea and China. We have some bilateral work also in the Arctic zone and the Arctic circumpolar activities in the Arctic Council, South America with Africa, and also Southeast Asia, where often the exchange of knowledge is so often to do with the methodologies and networking activities, that the approaches that we have towards these activities, particularly that's the case in South America, India, Southeast Asia, and Africa, where the methodological approach is very much the conversation we have with those countries. And then, of course, at the ICT level, we have a large collaboration with the Group on Earth Observations and the GeoGeos activities in UNEP Live as well. So that's the setting of all our work, contributing, and that's the approach and methodological background. There's two other concepts which I would like to introduce to you before I reach my conclusions. One concept is the recognition that in all of our activities, we're working along a chain of knowledge. And this is something which we're all doing, but we managed to make this extremely explicit, to be very clear to all of our stakeholders, that we're not just talking about monitoring data and collecting that and publishing that. We're actually talking about structuring that information in proper data and information sources with the appropriate metadata. This is a very strong and very detailed activity. It takes a lot of resources to get right. And if you do get it right, then you can apply the data for multiple purposes as underlined by the SICE approach. So SICE basically means that we need to have proper structured data with metadata. We then talk about interpretation of that data, where the information and indicators come. So that is putting the information data into some type of context, policy or otherwise. And then we integrate them in a way that provides assessments, interpretations of what that information means in the context of particular policy, for example, or particular issue. And then reflecting on what does that mean in terms of knowledge. So this MDIAK chain is extremely important for the work that we do, and we try to be explicit as possible. The other most important chain here is the so-called DPSIR framework, which you should be familiar with. It's something that we developed with colleagues and others in the early days from the OECD framework initially, where we specified the driving forces like agricultural transport from the pressures, which are the emissions, for example, from the state of the environment, the impacts, which are economic as well as health-wise, as well as ecosystem-wise, and the responses, the policy and other types of things. And in all our assessments, we try to make sure that we make a distinction between all of those different areas and link and join them up together. That's the methodology of integrated assessment. A few reflections now. I just got 3 reflections here on some of the key benefits. We're going through, as I mentioned, an evaluation. We've had a reflection recently from our INET about what do they find useful. Excuse me, I'm just having a sip of water. 3 main points that were raised there. These are not complete, of course, but the network basically points out that knowledge sharing and peer interaction for capacity building is extremely important, because it's difficult to follow all the policies and in the individual country level and develop capacity building. So the peer-to-peer across Europe participation is extremely important, particularly in supporting anticipation of new challenges and the development of new policies. So that's the first cluster. It's basically community co-sharing work, peer-to-peer relationships. The second is very technical, to do with data harmonization, methodologies, quality assurance, to ensure that we do that at a broad level and take advantage of the best expertise across Europe, but also internationally to make that happen. And the third area of benefit is to do with the uptake of national information in the European assessments and the use of European assessments in international and global assessments. The national countries find it difficult sometimes to penetrate the European and global levels, so that we facilitate that. The EEA facilitates that. So that's a quick summary of some key findings that are found from the countries about some of the key benefits. Now, if I now look to the future and some of the challenges that we've got to face, the 2015 report on the state of the environment, the one in purple in that diagram in the middle, basically said that the growing understanding of the way in which the challenges on Europe's environment are changing means that existing knowledge and governance approaches are inadequate. Now, we sometimes feel that the existing knowledge we have is sufficient, but actually it's not. We have to create new knowledge to deal with the interdependencies that we've got in these issues. And that, I think, is extremely important to recognize. Is not just business as usual doing better, it's actually different business as well. And the way that we look at this is that we have in Europe a policy context which talks to targets in 2020 and 2030, but with a vision in the 7th Environmental Action Programme to 2050, living well within the planet's ecological limits with the innovative circular economy, low carbon growth and societal resilience. This is a huge enterprise for which you need a transition in main systems. And this also needs to recognize that from global perspective, there are a number of global megatrends which are driving these activities, which Europe isn't in charge of. They're coming towards us, slightly coming towards other parts of the world, like increasing environmental pollution, changes in disease patterns, urbanization, ICT growth. And I emphasize the ICT growth because whilst it can cause a lot of problems, this is also creating more and new information for us to deal with. And so we have to create new techniques to face that. And another type of trend is the so-called post-truth trend, which is going on, whereby whatever expertise you have, whatever experts we've got in Europe, people just don't believe you. And they say, well, we don't trust experts. And so to develop approaches which can tackle that directly, which often means dealing with case studies, dealing with citizens on the ground, dealing with local issues, translating them to European and global levels, and seeing the significance of global and European policies at the local level, and putting that as part of our assessments, that we believe also will help counterbalance this post-truth syndrome, as well as utilizing other sources of data, such as from citizen science and from NGOs and from business as a source of information as well. And the systems that we're looking at, this is how we see the world in our assessments. We have all of the socio-technical systems embedded within the ecosystems. Energy, food, urban mobility are four ones which we highlight. And we now look at the world through these socio-technical systems as opposed to just looking at air quality or transport. We look at the whole system and make assessments on that basis. And at the moment, in this diagram, we're just going towards the right-hand part of the diagram. We're moving towards our 2020 report, where we're going to emphasize a lot more solutions and skills for governance approaches for transitions in our state and outlook report for the environment. So watch out for that and the developments that we will have. And we'll be collaborating with hopefully many of you in trying to develop this new approach towards 2020. A final couple of slides just to conclude is that we recognize very much that these sustainable development goals now are this, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, this very common language or Esperanto between different regions, countries of the world, which are very much embedded in the 7th Environmental Action Programme at European level. Priority Objective 1, protect and conserve the environment, relates to SDG 6, 14 and 15. The Priority Objective 2 of the 7th Environmental Action Programme, to turn the Union into resource efficient, green and competitive low carbon economy, relates to additional SDGs as marked here. And then the Priority Objective 3, to safeguard the Union citizens from environmental related pressures and risks to health, relate to other SDGs. So we do see it's extremely important to make that translation, because SDGs are for the European Union as well as for all the other countries together, and we will be making this translation in the course of our new assessments over the coming years. My final slide is just to summarize what we see as the challenges in this context for EEA and INET and globally. It's for us the way in which we can provide the relevant knowledge and co-create that together to support the sustainability goals and challenges, to understand the socio-technical systems which are underlying the environmental and social economic problems, and then directly supporting the transitions that are required from one way of doing things, one way of transporting, or one way of developing or producing food to a new way of producing food, for example, and trying to ensure that our work programs are addressing these issues directly and so are relevant very much to the policy perspective and the challenges at a local and global level for the European Union as well. So that concludes my presentation. I'm open for any questions that you've got, and I'll be very happy also to follow up with any of you afterwards if you would like, and if you would like to collaborate with us in this enterprise. So thank you very much, and back to you, Derek.
Great, thank you very much, David. As I said before you started, I can think of few people better qualified and experienced to talk to the Eye on Earth audience than yourself, and it was a rich source of information. I would call now for Joachim Zotlev from the UN Environment Head Office in Nairobi, Kenya, just to give a vote of thanks to David on behalf of the Eye on Earth Alliance. Joachim, are you there?
Yes, I am here, Derek. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I would just like to say thank you to the presenter of today, Dr. David Stanners, as well as the European Environment Agency at large, for giving this very interesting and comprehensive presentation. I think today we are joined by participants from many different parts of the world, and I'm sure that this presentation on the European experience has been most useful in terms of good practices for collecting, sharing, as well as using environmental data. And I think there is certainly a lot that we can learn from your record. And once again, thank you very much for sharing this with the network today. So I think now we would like to continue with some further questions by the participants. Over to you, Derek.
Great. Thank you very much, Joachim. So now, just whilst we'll give the audience a few seconds to prepare some questions. We have already received quite a number of questions in the queue here. I would ask if you could. I will prioritise, given the purpose of the Eye on Earth movement, questions that relate to information and knowledge related issues rather than environmental policy issues per se. There are many questions in the queue here that relate to very specific environmental policy issues. If time permits, we will get to those, but I will, if I'll ask for your forbearance, and I will put the questions that are more directly linked to the Eye on Earth agenda first. I see many questions coming in. That's great. Just whilst you do it, I will now share David's presentation. It is uploading now, 10-20%. There we go. So you should be receiving it in just a few moments. And just a reminder here on the protocol for asking questions. As I said before, please put just have a summary in the chat box, and I can then kind of moderate what's happening. I will invite people with selected questions to open your microphone and put the question directly to David. And I would ask, because of the international nature of the audience, if you would kindly just introduce yourself and your organization. So we'll start now with the first question. And I'm just trying to go through my prioritization list here. The first question, I will need to unmute you. There are, in fact, a number of questions from an old friend of Iron Earth, Dr. Noman Kader. Noman, I'll open your mic in just a second, but could I ask, perhaps, because you have put many questions in the list, would you like to perhaps put the question about the data gaps issue? Let me just bear with me 1 second, please, while I find you in the list here and open your mic. Why is it not showing your mic? There we go. Okay, Noman, your microphone is open if you'd like to put the question to David. Noman, do you hear us? Hi, Noman, do you hear us? Maybe I hear him typing. No, I think we'll have to come back to Noman. There seems to be an issue. There is another question here from Mona Galiani from Beirut, Lebanon. Mona, I will open your mic so you could put your question if you wish. Let me just, again, please just let me find you in the list here. Mona, would you like to put your question to David? Mona?
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everybody. I had sent questions about Lebanon because you mentioned previously that there is cooperation with the countries of neighborhood of Europe. We precisely in Lebanon, we have a lot of main cooperation with Europe. Precisely, Europe is very close to us, and also in our mentality, because we have been raised in. For me, for example, I am the student of Carmel Saint Joseph. I've been raised in French school, and then I studied at the AUB. So we have the European mentality, and we are very close with Europe, precisely. So for this reason, I was asking very specific questions. Sorry. Is there any cooperation between EEA and Lebanon for the crisis of environment?
Shall I answer directly?
Yes, this is only my question, because we are thriving about someone who can help really in Lebanon.
Please go ahead, David.
That's it.
Okay, so as I mentioned, yes, we do have a collaboration with Lebanon in the context of the European neighborhood activities that we have with the so-called European South activities, and Lebanon participates in those. We started the second phase of it. We started the first phase in 2000, but actually 2010, but actually the history goes back 10 years before then. But we have directed funding contribution from 2010, and a new phase now started last year, which will extend up to the beginning of 2020, which means that we will be developing together core indicators, supporting state environment reporting, and working together as a region, but also individually with Lebanon at the same time as well. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, David. The next question is from Florian Wetzel. Florian, if you would like to put your question, your mic is open.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Florian Wetzel from the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. So I was quite interested because you mentioned in your talk that one of the aims of the EEA was also to, let's say, improve.
No. What's happened? Do you hear, David, do you hear anything?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Did you hear Florian's question?
Heard the question?
Okay, it went silent for me. So, okay, if you'd like to answer then.
Oh, okay, you didn't hear it. No. Yes, so are there enhanced activities involved to improve the availability of disaggregated data? I think you've been asking particularly in the biodiversity field and others. So I wouldn't say there's enhanced, but there's ongoing work, both methodological in terms of standards and approaches and things to do with the metadata and information, which is being supported by, for example, the Inspire initiatives on the one hand, but also which is being promoted by the biodiversity activities or the other thematic activities beyond that field as well. So what we are doing is not trying to develop any new work. What we are doing is aligning ourselves together with the policy framework, which is supporting these different areas, and then ensuring that we have the most up-to-date aggregated information from different sources. So we're doing it in a very, I would say, pragmatic way, as needs be, as opposed from standing back in general and trying to create an overarching framework. We're doing it for the purposes of the policy support, step by step. And we're taking that approach because, of course, we do not have a large amount of resources to invest in major new interventions. And we also work through and with our partners in the countries. So part of the work that we do is to leverage and build capacity in those countries to do, in fact, that work itself. So it's a step-by-step process rather than a revolution. Okay?
Yeah, thanks, David.
Good, thank you. David, there's a question from Noman Kader. You may remember Noman from Genome Days.
I do remember Noman. Hello, Noman.
But he has asked me to read it. I think he's having some audio problems. His question reads, did the State of Environment reporting, I assume he means the SOER process, did it identify data gaps in specific areas, interdependence, interconnectivity, and governance shortcomings? Quite a broad question.
Right. Within the assessment, the State of Environment report, 5-year reports, we do talk about, for example, some governance shortcomings and systems issues. Yes. We don't, in the report, make an overview of gaps and requirements, but that is done in parallel processes to the report. Some key ones are identified, but there's not a systematic overview. In some earlier reports, actually, we did do that. We made an annex of systematic overview of gaps. This is not done as part of the assessment report anymore, but it's part of the general work that we develop in the various thematic and sectoral areas to identify those data and information gaps. We do instead, as I mentioned in the presentation, more talk about knowledge gaps. Like, for example, understanding how we can transition our energy system from a carbon-based one to a renewables one. We have a large amount of knowledge gaps there, and also knowledge gaps about impacts also of renewables and of the transition system itself. So that we need to look at all those issues from the knowledge perspective. And so we do, yes, address those knowledge gaps, which then, of course, need to be translated back into information and data gaps, which could probably then be supported through maybe research projects or other targeted activities as well. So part of our work is to try to identify those so that others can help to try to fill those areas. And of course, then we will work on and utilize the results of some of that research as useful in our future reports.
Thank you, David. I'm conscious of time, so I'm displaying now on the screen the upcoming webinars. So perhaps you can cast your eye over that whilst you listen to David's answers. Because of time, I think we'll make the next question the last. There's a question from Gisbert Bokot, which is a question I would have asked if I'd been in the audience. So Gisbert, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, I'll open your microphone if you want to put your question. Hello? Okay, well, maybe some issue there. I'll read the question on his behalf. The question is, does the EEA have a methodology where the MDIAK approach is linked with the DPSIR approach?
So does it have a methodology whereby they're linked? Interesting question, because we talk about this ourselves. You could argue, so we don't have a formal approach or methodology which formally links those, because we see those very much as two separate dimensions. So MDIAK cuts across DPSIR. So what I mean by that is, at every point of the DPSIR, let's just take P, the pressures, there is monitoring going on of, for example, emissions. There is data, there's indicators, there's information, and there's responses going on. But of course, it's not entirely like that, because the responses themselves are not only orientated and matched towards a particular type of emission, in my example. The responses are usually a response to more the integrated understanding of the knowledge base. So whilst they are two different dimensions, MDIAK and DPSIR also live in two different spaces, depending upon whether you are producing the knowledge or whether you're analyzing the knowledge. So I would argue that basically the MDIAK is most useful in trying to analyze and create a balance in your production system. And DPSIR is primarily useful and useful to support and underpin the integrated assessment output orientation of the work. So that's the difference where they lie. MDIAK more to do with the underpinning inputs, DPSIR more to do with the analysis and outputs. I hope I've answered your question. It's an interesting point that we could probably talk about for quite a long time, together with some other concepts, which I think you would need to also connect with this. And I would then add concepts, for example, not just like sustainability, but also the proportionality principle, the precautionary principle, uncertainty, and ignorance as well. Because I think those elements also help us understand where we lie in the chain of MDIAK and DPSIR, but they also help identify what we still need to develop in terms of new knowledge, so that we can face issues of ignorance and uncertainty, which face most of the issues that which we are looking at. So that's the first answer to that question. I'll be very happy to debate that point even more with you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, David. I think we do need to bring it to a close. If I could just ask, and people are dropping off now, there was one last question perhaps we could put. I think it requires a fairly short answer. It's from Michelle Slaney. Michelle, your mic is open if you wish to put the question.
Hi, can you hear me? Thanks
Yes.
very much for the presentation. I'm from Memorial University of Newfoundland, and I'm coordinating a knowledge network across the circumpolar Arctic. So you mentioned that you do have collaborations in the circum-Arctic context, and you mentioned the Arctic Council. I didn't quite understand what the collaborations were. Was it in relation to data or methodologies, or if you could elaborate a little more on that?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Michelle, for the question. We are supporting the European Union at the Arctic Council level in terms of its inputs, its reports, its position on issues with respect to knowledge. But we're also participators for many years in the SEON network, the Sustaining Arctic Observation Network of networks, effectively. And there we are contributing our network expertise and the various countries which have themselves in Europe Arctic knowledge, and support those countries to provide that and make that available for Arctic assessments, for example, through AMAP. So we're working in those two modes, through the EU, supporting the formal EU contributions, and then through the countries, and mainly to support the assessments which are carried out through AMAP. We also have direct contacts with AMAP in the development of their assessments reports, where we provide advice, knowledge, review sometimes into those activities as they are underway before publication as well.
Great. Thank you, David. With that, I will bring it to a close. There are still plenty of questions in the queue. I will share those with David so that he perhaps can respond to you. But we've now overshot the hour quite substantially. Just before I do close the screen, I have been sharing in the background there currently my contact details and the Eye on Earth contact details. And I hope you had a chance to review the upcoming webinar list, which is on the screen at the moment. I'm really delighted that we have a fantastic series of people who have agreed to give webinars. Just very briefly, William Bill Sontag from the Geo Secretariat will be talking to us on 26th of April on Geo's work in support of the SDGs. Then on the 3rd of May, we have a joint presentation by Craig Mills of Visuality, CEO of Visuality, and Francis Gassert from another Eye on Earth Alliance partner, WRI. Bill Sontag, who's from Geo, is from the Alliance. Francis from WRI is from the Alliance. On the 10th of May, just a week later, we have Alex Caldaz, Chief of Country Outreach at UN Environment, who will talk to us about the Environment Live open access platform. On the 17th of May, PJ Stevenson from IUCN, yet another Alliance organization, is going to talk to us about a paper that they've recently published calling for big data for biodiversity and the need for field-based species monitoring to complement remote sensing activities. And at the end of May, Pierre Buttigieg from the Max Planck Institute will talk to us about capturing and harmonizing knowledge behind sustainable development, a point that David addressed towards the end of his presentation. So we have a full packed program of fantastic speakers. I encourage you all to join them. You will be receiving emails for each of those as they approach. I thank you all for being on the webinar today and staying right through to the end. We will be sharing with all registrants the recording. If you can give me, I'll try to get it out within the week. There's not much editing to do, so it shouldn't take long. And hope to see you on a future webinar. So with that, I will close the webinar and just extend my own personal thanks to David and to the EEA for this fantastic presentation and giving us so much of his time, not just today, but in the preparation and in the weeks that has led up to this. So thank you, everyone, and speak to you next time.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. I'm closing now.